In 1960, on Father's Day, more than 60,000 people came to a marsh in the Bronx. They came to visit what was advertised as the largest outdoor entertainment center on Earth, a park built in the shape of the United States, where you could watch Chicago burn down, ride through a Civil War battlefield, and feel San Francisco come apart under your feet. The traffic the next day was so bad the park had to stop selling tickets. It had been designed by the man who picked the site for Disneyland. It lasted 5 summers. Then it was flattened. The largest cooperative housing development in the world was built on top of it, and today the only thing left is a rock with a plaque on it, sitting outside a bagel shop. The strangest part isn't that it failed, it's that serious people have spent decades arguing it was never meant to succeed. That's one place on this list, and it isn't the one that hits hardest, because somewhere else in this state there's a hotel that burned to the ground with its water shut off, and that fire is the reason 1 million people a year can walk that land today for free. New York built hundreds of places that people planned whole summers around. These are 10 of them that are gone, and the specific reason each one went. Number 10. Celeron Park, Chautauqua Lake. Picture a summer evening in 1912. You're on a wooden midway at the southern tip of Chautauqua Lake, and above you there's a Ferris wheel called the Phoenix, 125 feet of iron, put up in 1896, big enough to lift 200 people off the ground at once. Behind you, a wooden roller coaster. To your right, a slide that drops you into the lake. And every few minutes another trolley pulls in from Jamestown and empties onto the boardwalk. You aren't here for the afternoon. There's a hotel on this property called the Hotel de Celeron and rooming houses along the streets behind it, and families booked in for a week or 2 at a time, because this was where Western New York went on vacation. It opened in 1894. The Celeron Amusement Company built it as a deliberate copy of Coney Island and Atlantic City, and it worked well enough that people started calling it the Coney Island of Chautauqua. There was a zoo, there was a baseball diamond, and the historical marker on the site records that Babe Ruth hit a ball out of it and into the lake before a game in 1921. There was an auditorium that served as a dance hall, a roller rink and an ice rink depending on the month, and a theater that became a ballroom where the touring dance bands of the 30s and 40s played. A local teenager worked the food stand selling hot dogs and hamburgers. Her name was Lucille Ball. What killed Celeron Park wasn't competition. It was access. This park had no road worth speaking of. The trolley line and the lake steamers weren't a convenience. They were the only practical way in. And once ordinary families owned cars, the trolleys and the steamers stopped running. Then cars became interstates, and the traffic that used to arrive in the region began driving past it instead. Attendance fell hard after the Second World War. In the early 1950s, the Phoenix was taken apart and sold. Fires took buildings. In 1959, a tornado came through and destroyed rides the owners couldn't find a reason to rebuild. In 1962, a businessman from Pittsburgh bought the property and scrapped what was left, ending a 68-year run. Today the footprint holds a hotel and a public park with a playground and a band shell and a bronze statue facing the water. The park is named after the girl who sold the hot dogs. Number 9. Rosland Park, Canandaigua. If you owned a cottage on the north shore of Canandaigua Lake in 1970, you didn't have to visit Rosland Park to know it was open. You could hear it. Carnival music carried across the water every night from May through September, and on Labor Day people stood out on their docks to listen. It called itself the Playground of the Finger Lakes, and for children in that part of the state it came with a fixed date attached. Roseland was the 8th grade class trip, and you waited years for your turn. Families rented cottages by the week to be near it. A Rochester produce merchant named William Muir opened it in 1925 on an old farm. It grew into 56 acres, 13 major attractions, and 7 kiddie rides. In 1960 it got the Skyliner, a wooden coaster 60 feet tall and 2,400 feet long that ran at 40 miles an hour. And at the center of it sat a hand-carved carousel the park had bought second-hand in 1941 from a Syracuse park that had already gone out of business, which is a detail worth holding on to. Nothing dramatic ever happened to Roseland. That's why it's on this list. The scale of American amusement changed underneath it. Darien Lake opened. The regional megapark arrived, and 56 acres beside a lake had no answer to a park with 100 rides and a hotel attached. Insurance climbed, maintenance climbed, and the vacation itself changed shape as people started driving 2 hours to a destination park and staying overnight rather than driving 20 minutes to the lake. The owners didn't fight it. They looked at the numbers, announced the closure for the end of the season, and let people come and say goodbye. The last day was Labor Day, the 2nd of September 1985. 2 weeks later, they auctioned the park off in pieces. Arcade games, ride motors, signs. Hundreds of people turned up to buy fragments of their own childhoods. The carousel was the fight. A committee called Hold Your Horses formed to keep it in Canandaigua, and lost. It sold for $397,500 to a developer from Syracuse who spent 2 years and more than $1 million restoring it. New oak floor, every hand-carved horse repaired. The park itself is a housing development now. The carousel Roseland bought from a dead park in 1941 is still turning, about 90 miles away, under the skylight of a shopping mall in Syracuse. Number 8. The Land of Makebelieve, Upper J. Everything here was built at half scale, and that was the whole idea. A castle a child could walk into, a riverboat, a train with cars big enough for exactly 1 passenger, a pony-sized stagecoach, a little western town called Cactus Flats, fairy tale houses sized for the people who lived in the stories. Parents were told, more or less directly, to sit on a bench and stay out of it, because the park wasn't for them. It sat in the hamlet of Upper J, in the Adirondacks. Whiteface was right there, and Lake Placid was up the road, and families took a cabin, or a motel room, for a week in the mountains, and gave 1 day of it to the children. That day was this. The man who built it was Arto Monaco. Born in Au Forks in 1913, he went out to Hollywood, made sets and illustrations and toys, worked for Walt Disney, and then came home. He designed Santa's Workshop up at the North Pole in 1949, one of the first theme parks in America. He consulted on Frontier Town in 1952, which you'll hear about shortly. He designed pieces of Storytown, which you know now as The Great Escape. He wanted to call his own park Storytown. The name was already taken by the park that became The Great Escape, so he named it after a song instead. He opened it in 1954, on his own land, a short walk from the Au Sable River. Within months, the river came over its banks and flooded it. That's the cause of death, and it's almost unfair in how simple it is. Not a highway, not the airlines, a river, doing what rivers do. It flooded the Land of Makebelieve roughly a dozen times across 25 years. Every time, Monaco and his crew salvaged what they could, rebuilt, repainted, and reopened, and every rebuild cost more than the last one. The floods and a run of illnesses ruined him financially, and he was never the kind of man who thought to protect himself with royalties or licensing. In 1979, after the 11th or 12th flood, depending on who's counting, he stopped. What survived was sold off to Storytown, where his fiberglass horses and his little train carried other people's children for years. The buildings were left standing in the woods. For 32 years, you could walk in and find a child-sized castle going green under the trees. Then, on the 28th of August, 2011, Hurricane Irene put the Au Sable River over its banks one more time and took the castle and the last of the buildings with it. One building survived. A family salvaged the old gift shop, and today they grind coffee beans in it. Number 7. Fantasy Island, Grand Island. Everything else on this list ended a long time ago. This one closed 4 months before this video went up. Fantasy Island opened on the 1st of July 1961 on Grand Island in the Niagara River, about 12 minutes from Niagara Falls, 16 from downtown Buffalo, 85 acres. It was never the biggest park in America, and never pretended to be. What it was, for 2 generations of Western New York and Southern Ontario families, was the summer. There was a Wild West shootout show with a villain called Black Bart, performed several times a day for decades by actors who became local celebrities. There was a water park bolted on in the boom years. And there was the Silver Comet, a coaster with a bloodline running back to the legendary Crystal Beach across the water in Canada. It anchored a whole vacation economy. Campgrounds and motels sat up and down the boulevard because the park was there. Families took a week on Grand Island, did the Falls one day and Fantasy Island the next. The property was assessed at around $4 million and generated something like $125,000 a year in taxes for the town. Here's what went wrong, and it's the most modern failure on this list. In 2016, the park was sold to a company based in California. Over the next few seasons, visitors and coaster enthusiasts kept reporting the same things. Rides sitting broken, whole attractions closed, the place understaffed. The company said it had invested. Operating results didn't improve. On the 19th of February 2020, with season passes for the coming summer already sold out, the company confirmed that Fantasy Island was permanently closed. Then it started selling the rides. The state attorney general had to negotiate a settlement to get pass holders their money back. And then something unusual happened. Somebody tried to bring it back. A new operator leased the property in May 2021, renamed it Niagara Amusement Park and Splash World, and started rebuilding. New rides going in. The water park reopening. The Midway coming back online piece by piece across 2 seasons. Local people wanted it badly. The man who played Black Bart got his old cast together to campaign for it. It wasn't enough. The park ran its last day on the 22nd of September, 2025. On the 30th of April this year, the operators announced it wouldn't open for the 2026 season at all, that attendance and revenue had never covered the cost of running and rebuilding it, and that the future use of the property was undetermined. So it's still standing. Fences up, rides in place, nobody inside. Which makes this the only entry on this list where we don't yet know how the story ends. Number 6. Frontier Town, North Hudson. Take exit 29 off the Northway today and you'll find a rest stop in an A-frame building. Bathrooms, snacks, souvenirs. That A-frame was the entrance gate to a Wild West town, and the town is still back there in the trees. Frontier Town opened in 1952 on United States Route 9 in North Hudson, deep in the Adirondacks, with Arto Monaco Consulting on the design. There was a rodeo, a stagecoach, a narrow-gauge railroad, a log flume, and staged gunfights and bank robberies on a dirt main street several times a day. Route 9 was the road north. Every family driving up into the mountains went past that gate, and enormous numbers of them stopped, and then stayed, because North Hudson had built itself entirely around the traffic. Motels, cabins, restaurants, gas stations, and a hotel up on the ridge with a view down the valley. You booked a week in the Adirondacks and gave day 2 to Frontier Town. Then the state built a highway. The Adirondack Northway, Interstate 87, opened through this stretch in the 1960s, and it did the one thing a roadside attraction cannot survive. It didn't compete with Frontier Town. It went around it. Travelers who used to pass the gate at 35 miles an hour now went by at 70, a mile away, with no reason to take an exit. That was the wound. 2 other things finished it. Cheap air travel meant a family with 2 weeks and some savings could choose Florida or Europe over Essex County. And the Western stopped being what children wanted. The genre vanished from television, and by the 1980s a park built around staged gunplay had become something parents felt they had to explain. The man who built it retired in 1985. New owners couldn't make the arithmetic work, and Frontier Town closed in 1998. What happened next is the part people underestimate. The park didn't die quietly on its own. It took the town with it. Nearly every hotel, store, and gas station in North Hudson closed behind it. The county ended up owning that hotel on the ridge, hoping an engineer might one day say it was worth saving. The site came partly back. New York State opened a campground and day-use area on the 91 acres along the Schroon River in 2019, with 77 campsites, 19 of them for people traveling with horses. The A-frame reopened as the rest stop. Out in the woods beyond the campsites, there are still log cabins, rusted rail and foundations. The rodeo arena and the boardwalk came down by 2025. Number 5. The Catskill Game Farm. There's a hotel in Greene County where the rooms are inside a barn that was built for giraffes. Around it, spread across most of 914 acres, there's an abandoned zoo. It started in the early 1930s. The exact year is genuinely disputed, with sources giving anything from 1933 to 1945, when a New York City banker named Roland Lindemann, a German immigrant who'd arrived as a teenager in 1923, stocked some land in the Catskills with deer. Friends came out at weekends. Word spread. He quit the bank and moved up. In 1958, the United States Department of Agriculture formally recognized it as a zoo, which made it the first privately owned zoo in the country and allowed Lindemann to import animals the way a serious institution could. He brought in white rhinos. He brought in 55 Przewalskis and Tarpan horses from Germany, and Przewalski's horses were by then extinct in the wild and existed only in captivity. At its height, the collection ran to around 2,000 animals, across roughly 150 species, and something in the region of 500,000 people came through the gate every year. Most of them weren't day trippers. They were people already staying in the Catskills, the bungalow colonies, the big hotels, the summer rentals, and the game farm was the outing that filled one whole day of a 2-week holiday. 3 generations of the same families came back to the same fence. And that's the mechanism that killed it. The game farm didn't lose its appeal. It lost the thing that delivered its customers. Cheap air travel emptied the Catskills, the hotels closed one after another, and the audience that had filled the game farm's parking lot simply wasn't in the county anymore. Business had peaked back in the 1960s. Costs climbed. So did animal welfare regulation, reasonably but expensively, and a private zoo living on gate receipts had no way to absorb it. Then it got darker. Lindemann sold to his daughter and son-in-law in 1989. Her husband was an animal importer, and over the following years reporting connected the farm to the canned hunt trade, in which animals are sold to be shot at close range by trophy hunters. The New York Times later reported that more than 150 animals from the farm had been shipped to Texas, and that what became of them afterward wasn't clear. Other zoos stopped trading with it. The Catskill Game Farm closed on Columbus Day, the 9th of October 2006, after roughly 73 years. The 2-day auction drew more than 1,000 bidders from 3 countries, and there were protests over where some of the animals ended up. One giraffe born there in 2002 was sold onto a park near Binghamton, where years later a live stream of her giving birth was watched by millions of people who had no idea where she came from. The property sat empty for 6 years. New owners bought it in 2012, and the giraffe barn opened as a hotel in October 2019. The rest of it is still out there. The Rhino House, with the public viewing rail bolted to the wall. A photo kiosk advertising film for sale. That last one closed in 2006, which means a lot of you were actually there. So let me ask you something, and I'm asking because I want to know. If you're from New York, what's a vacation spot you remember that's either gone now or completely unrecognizable? A resort, a park, a lake place, a hotel your parents took you to every August. Put the name in the comments. Some of you remember places that have fallen out of the history books entirely, and honestly, half the research for the next one of these comes straight out of that comment section. Alright, the last 4 are different. Everything up to this point happened to these places. What's left is what somebody decided. Number 4. Rockaways Playland, Queens. The subway station at Beach 98th Street in Queens had a different name for 52 years. From 1933 it was called Playland, because when the doors opened, the park was right there. Rockaway Beach was New York City's beach resort, and that isn't a figure of speech. There were bungalow colonies, rooming houses and hotels where families from Manhattan and Brooklyn took a place for the entire summer while the men commuted in. Playland sat at the center of it, and you could reach it by ferry, by rail, by trolley, or by subway. It was founded in 1901 by Lamarcus Adna Thompson, the man who built the first roller coaster in America. Under a Queens lawyer named Joseph Geist, who bought it in 1928, it became enormous. A dance hall, a menagerie, new coasters, and by 1936, advertisements boasting 24 separate attractions. The Atom Smasher coaster appeared in the film This Is Cinerama in 1952, which is how people who never went there can still watch it run. Between 1928 and 1970, roughly 175 million people came through. In 1937, Robert Moses came for it. Moses wanted a shorefront parkway, and he condemned a strip 200 feet wide running 2.5 miles along the water. Nearly half of Rockaway's Playland was destroyed, and Geist lost half his rides. Moses also demolished the bungalows nearby, and there's a reasonable argument that shutting the park down was the objective rather than a side effect of it. Geist rebuilt anyway. It cost somewhere between $3 and $5 million, and Playland reopened in 1939, smaller and still packed. It ran beauty contests on Monday evenings and children's contests on Saturday afternoons. When Geist died in 1960, his son took over. The parkway Moses took half the park to build is still there. Locals call it the road to nowhere, because neither end of it really goes anywhere. It was meant to be part of a grand shorefront drive running from Brooklyn to the Hamptons, and the rest of it was never built. The long decline came from familiar forces. The direct rail connection to the peninsula ended in the 1950s, and the Rockaways stopped being where the city went in July. The neighborhood changed. Attendance thinned every year. Then, in the mid-1980s, the park got its liability insurance renewal. The premium went from around $50,000 to over $408,000 in a single year. Playland's own safety record wasn't the trigger. The entire American amusement industry was being repriced at once, and a park this size had no way to carry it. There was no argument to have. Playland didn't open again after the 1985 season. The Atom Smasher came down. The site was cleared in 1987 and sold for a $30 million condominium development. A park built by the man who invented the roller coaster survived Robert Moses and was finished off by an actuary. Number 3. Freedomland USA, the Bronx. On the 19th of June 1960, Father's Day, more than 60,000 people arrived at a marsh on the edge of the Bronx. The traffic the following day was so bad that the park had to stop selling tickets at the gate. They'd come to Freedomland USA, advertised without much modesty as the world's largest outdoor entertainment center. The attractions covered about 85 acres, laid out in the shape of the lower 48 states, so that walking from one themed area to another meant walking across the country. Old Chicago burned down for you. San Francisco came apart in 1906. You rode a wagon through a Civil War battlefield under cannon fire, paddled a bullboat through the Northwest Passage, and shopped in a replica of Macy's as it had looked in the 1800s. There were more than 40 attractions. The Ed Sullivan Show ran a preview and called it the East Coast's equal to Disneyland. And it wasn't only a Bronx day out. Organized excursions came in from across the Northeast. Scout outings, newspaper trips, church buses, and families drove in from other states and stayed over to do it properly. The park's own planners talked about eventually turning the whole site into a year-round amusement district. The man who built it was Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood, and this is where it gets interesting. Wood had been hired by Walt Disney in 1953. He was the person who selected the orange grove in California where Disneyland got built, and he managed its construction and its early operation. Then he and Disney fell out badly, and Wood left to build a rival on the other coast, on land owned by the real estate developer William Zeckendorf. It cost $65 million, something in the region of $600 million in today's money, which is more than it now costs to build a major theme park from scratch. By the end of the first season, it was $8 million in debt. The problem was structural, and it's why this one sits at number 3. History is something you consume once. You'll ride a roller coaster 4 times in an afternoon and come back next summer. Watching Chicago burn down is fascinating exactly one time. Management understood the trouble and began adding conventional rides, but conventional rides were what Coney Island and Palisades already had, closer and cheaper. By 1963, they'd sold part of the site to a Teamsters pension fund and closed off an entire section of the park. Then the 1964 World's Fair opened across the city in Queens, with Walt Disney's own pavilions inside it. Freedomland filed for bankruptcy in September 1964 and never opened again. Demolition ran into 1965, and by 1966, the ground was being prepared for Co-op City. And here is the unresolved part, which I'll give you as a dispute, because that is what it is. The park's own historian, Michael Vergentino, argues that Freedomland was never intended to last, that the buildings existed to prove Bronx marshland could carry multi-story apartment towers and to move the zoning along, and that Wood himself was never told. Zeckendorf has been quoted describing the park as a device to hold the land. Other researchers think that's hindsight finding a pattern in an ordinary business failure, and they point out that at the opening the buildings were publicly described as built to last 50 years. Nobody has settled it. What is certain is what stands there now. Co-op City, the largest cooperative housing development in the world, more than 30 apartment towers on the footprint, and a shopping center called Bay Plaza, and one rock, with a plaque on it, sitting outside a bagel shop. Number 2. The Cliff House and Wildmere, Lake Minnewaska. There's a small glacial lake on top of a ridge in Ulster County, with white cliffs dropping straight into the water. On a summer weekend, there are hundreds of people up there, swimming, hiking the carriage roads, photographing the lake from the rocks. It's one of the most photographed places in the Hudson Valley, and it costs about $10 to park. Almost nobody up there knows that 2 enormous hotels stood on those cliffs for a century, or that the reason anyone can walk that land at all is that both of them burned. The Cliff House went up in 1879, built by Alfred Smiley, and it held 225 guests. The Wildmere opened in 1887, with room for 350, and took a large addition in 1910. They belonged to the Smiley family, Quakers, who also ran the Mohonk Mountain House a few miles north, and the proposition was as much moral as it was scenic. No alcohol. Carriage roads cut by hand into the Shongunk conglomerate. Guests booked weeks at a time, some of them the entire season, and what these hotels were actually selling was silence. That model held for about 70 years and then stopped making sense. In 1955, the family sold the property, and around 10,000 acres with it, to their own general manager, Kenneth Phillips. Phillips could see what was coming and tried to modernize. He put in a ski center. He ended the temperance rule and started serving alcohol at a resort built specifically on not serving it. It made no difference, because the customer he was trying to keep had stopped existing. The family that took a clifftop room for 6 weeks was being replaced by a family that took a flight for 10 days. And 2 vast wooden buildings on top of a ridge became impossible to heat, to staff, and to repair. The Cliff House was abandoned in 1972, purely because maintaining it cost more than it brought in. By 1976, the owners were bankrupt. By 1977, the family was out of money with the property up for sale, and there were people getting into the empty hotel and lighting fires in it. On the evening of New Year's Day, 1978, the Cliff House burned. Arson was suspected. Heavy snow kept the fire companies from getting up the mountain, and when they finally reached the top, they discovered that the building's water and sprinklers had been shut off, which removed the only water source on the ridge. It was over by midnight. A century of the place went in a few hours, and the hotel was uninsured. The Wildmere was still standing. It had closed in 1979, and by then the fight was over. What would replace it? Because the Marriott Corporation wanted a high-end resort on the lake. Environmental groups sued. The plan was defeated in 1985. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in June 1986, the Wildmere burned too. New York State bought the property in 1987 and opened the Minnewaska State Park Preserve in 1993. So what's up there now is foundations, stone terraces and steps, and the carriage roads the Smileys cut by hand, which are the trails everybody hikes. And underneath all of it sits an uncomfortable fact. If either hotel had survived, this would be a resort today, with a gate and a room rate, instead of a preserve anyone can walk into for the price of parking. The buildings had to be destroyed for the view to become public. And number 1. The Lake Placid Club. Lake Placid has hosted the Winter Olympics twice, a village of a few thousand people in the middle of the Adirondack woods, and the games came in 1932 and again in 1980. That happened because of a private club. The club is gone now, erased so completely that most visitors walk across the ground without knowing anything was ever there. It began in 1895, when Melville Dewey and his wife Annie took a hotel on the shore of Mirror Lake. Dewey is the man behind the Dewey Decimal System, the librarian who organized how books sit on shelves in most of the world, and what he wanted here was somewhere teachers and librarians could rest cheaply and improve themselves. What he built was one of the largest private resorts in American history. By 1923, the Lake Placid Club covered roughly 9,600 acres and included 356 buildings, 110 of them houses. It had its own theater, its own library, its own school, which still exists today as Northwood School, its own farms, its own boathouses, its own fire department. At its peak, it employed more than 1,100 people. Those 110 houses tell you what the business actually was. Members didn't come for a weekend. They took a cottage for the season, arrived with trunks and staff and children, and stayed for months at a time. The club's entire economic model was the long stay. In 1907, it did the thing that changed everything. It built a winter clubhouse and stayed open through the cold, which almost nobody did, and in doing so it more or less invented the Adirondack winter season, skating, sledding, and skiing on a scale nowhere else in the country had. Dewey's son Godfrey then used the club's facilities and its national reputation to win the 1932 Winter Olympics for the village. Without the club, Lake Placid would not have qualified. Melville Dewey died in 1931, the year before the games he had made possible. Membership held for decades and began falling away after 1971. Partly that was money. Partly it was arithmetic, because there were fewer and fewer families left in America who wanted to spend an entire season in one place. But there is a second reason, and it is why this one is at number 1. For most of its existence, the Lake Placid Club excluded Jews and other minorities by written rule, printed in its own circulars. The wording was bureaucratic, and it was explicit. The club would accept no member or guest against whom there was physical, moral, social, or racial objection, or who would be unwelcome to even a small minority of the membership. It stated that the rule was rigidly enforced, and that exceptions could not be made for Jews regardless of their personal qualifications. None of this was hidden, and it did not go unchallenged at the time. In 1904, petitions reached the New York State Board of Regents demanding Dewey's removal as state librarian over it. He kept the policy anyway. And this practice was widespread among American resorts of that era, rather than unique to Lake Placid, which is a significant part of the reason a separate resort economy grew up in the Catskills at all, serving the families that places like this turned away. Every other destination on this list tried to change and failed. This one refused to change the single thing that mattered. The exclusivity that made the club desirable in 1900 is what made it indefensible by 1975. It closed on the 30th of March 1980, weeks after serving as headquarters for the International Olympic Committee at the Winter Games, in the same village and the same season as the Miracle on Ice. Then it rotted. Through the 1990s, the empty buildings burned repeatedly and were vandalized. A local hotelier bought the property in 1996. The last of the main buildings came down in January 2002, and in 2019, the American Library Association removed Dewey's name from its top award. What's left on the site is golf, and a handful of renovated cottages, but the real remains aren't on the site at all. The ski jumps are the remains. The oval is. The entire tourist economy of Lake Placid is. Millions of people have visited the thing this club built without ever hearing its name, and most of them would have been turned away at its gate. 10 places, and not one of them died the way people assume these places die. There's no single villain in it. A river won. A highway went around a town. An insurance premium tripled overnight. A trolley line stopped running and took a park down with it. A zoo couldn't afford the standards it should have been meeting. A theme park may or may not have been a rezoning strategy wearing a costume. A club's own membership rule outlived its usefulness, and then outlived the club. What connects them isn't the cause. It's the assumption underneath. Every one of these places was built by someone who believed that the way people traveled in his lifetime was the way people would always travel, that the trains would keep coming, that families would keep spending 2 weeks somewhere instead of 2 hours, that a week at a lake in your own state would always be enough. New York had more of these places than almost anywhere in America, precisely because so many people in one city needed somewhere to go in July. They weren't built to be abandoned. They were built on the assumption that people would always come back. That's the only thing every single one of them got wrong. So, of all 10 of these, which one would you most want to see for one day at its absolute peak? Drop the number and the name in the comments. I'll read them. And if you actually went to any of these before they closed, tell us what you remember, where you stayed, what it smelled like, what your parents complained about. First-hand memories like that hold on to pieces of New York that photographs never quite catch, and there are people in that comment section who'll be very glad you wrote it down. And if you like finding the New York that disappeared, subscribing takes 1 second. There's a lot of it still out there.